Hi friends, and welcome to the program. As you can tell by my breath, it's pretty chilly here on our bend in the river. The days are getting shorter, the nights longer and colder, there's snow in the air. Yeah, it's the holiday season. And while we truly enjoy the holiday season, it certainly brings on an extra load, a lot more things to do. In fact, Tia and I were talking just the other day about getting some gifts for our children and our grandchildren, what they might like. And it occurred to me during that conversation, we hadn't gotten you anything yet. So after racking my brain a little, I decided the best thing I could give you is a little bit of warmth. So today's show is just that, some warm, sunny days, in fact, really warm and sunny. You see, last September, we went out to Wyoming to do an archery deer hunt out at Thomas Ranch Outfitters, and by we, I mean Tia and I, and we were joined by Brad and Justin Morgan. And together, we were going to do an early season hunt, and usually this is a great time of the year to be out. Cool mornings and warm afternoons, predictable feed pattern deer that have seen no pressure for a year. I said usually for a reason, however, because this was the hottest, driest fall in history in a lot of the western U.S., but you know us, there's no quit in our outfit. It was incredibly hot, incredibly dry, but we got after it, and believe it or not, we actually got on some really great deer. Hey, I'm your host, Kyle Randall. This is my Wilderness Journal, and we're headed out west for some really hot hunting right now. We rolled in that afternoon, and after chatting with Eric and Mike a bit, tried to sleep, but even the moon still looked hot when we headed out the next morning. Eric had seen some mule deer in a nearby pasture, so we crawled out and tried to get on them, but it wasn't until the following evening that we actually saw anything moving at all. At about 5:30, I noticed a red fox working its way down past us, and about a half hour after that, a couple of mule deer were slowly working their way up over the hill. I caught a little movement, and there was a bunch of turkeys coming across the hayfield, and not far behind them. At least I wasn't the only one out hunting in that heat. And unfortunately, for the fox anyway, the turkeys were on to him, so he slowly made a turn and started heading up the field in the other direction. And even though he was headed more or less toward the mule deer at the far end of the field, I was fairly certain he was just hunting mice. And not long after the fox passed back into the creek bottom, cover set, I saw another critter coming our way. You want to go on a skunk hunt? No. I remember asking T if she was interested in a skunk hat, but she assured me that wasn't in fashion this season, so... There's some mule deer coming in. Yes, we watched him pass and then noticed a couple of more mule deer working their way out as it was getting dark. And unfortunately, that was about all we saw that evening. The next afternoon, though, just before sunset, we were actually seeing some whitetail movement. At first it was just a doe and a fawn, and I was watching them working across in front of us when I noticed her watching up the hill. I looked, and that's the kind of deer I'd come to Wyoming for. Here was a big old buck, appeared to be a 10-point. He'd just cleared the fence or come from somewhere, I don't know, but he was working his way slowly down the hill, more or less in our direction. I kept thinking to myself, man, if this thing gets down here, we're actually going to get this hunt done on the second night. I couldn't believe it. As he slowly, agonizingly slowly, worked his way down through that field, I had plenty of time to look him over. This was at least a 3 or 4 year old buck, maybe even 5. He had really nice G2s and 3s. His 4s weren't all that long, but I gotta tell you folks, this was a perfect Wyoming whitetail, symmetrical, even. The only bad thing about him was, he was 100 yards away. He needed to get a lot closer, and he needed to do it pretty quick. The light was fading. It wouldn't be long before, it was too dark. I sat there, watching him pose on the skyline, thinking to myself, man, we were so close. That buck was definitely a shooter, and even though he didn't show up till real late, and he never really did come close enough to take a reasonable shot at, I was still some inspired. I thought in all this heat we wouldn't see any deer, let alone a mature buck like that, up on its feet in the daylight. Still, it was hot, it was sweaty, so we decided we were going to rest that stand. The wind was turning to the south, terrible for that location, so we backed out, decided to take another stand along some irrigated alfalfa down by a river. Eric's got plenty of leases, and we were going to wait till it was just right to try and get back in there on that deer, and who knows, we might see another one before we ever got back.
You're kidding me.
Deer hunting, right?
I'm going back in.
No, we didn't go in. We went out, and in fact, on the way, I noticed this little deer.
This is deer camp.
Right in the middle of somebody's deer camp.
Why did we set up here? Oh, I don't know. I wonder if that deer can smell that barbecue.
This was obviously not a shooter. Convenient, but not a shooter, so we headed for the trees. And about an hour before sunset, I was actually starting to see some deer moving around. There were a lot of irrigated hay fields down along this section of the river, and the deer were getting up out of the cover and moving out to feed. I was kind of surprised we saw them this early. It was still like 90 degrees outside, but slowly they were working their way out. We had to sit real still as that doe passed beneath our stand, but when she finally got off to the side, I could turn my head and look out in the field. There was a couple of deer starting to work our way, and at least one of them looked like a decent buck. As the shadows of late afternoon began to stretch out, it seemed like every direction I looked in I could see a deer feeding or moving out to feed, including a pretty nice 8 or 9 point. He wasn't real wide, but he was really high, fairly heavy. I could see he was panting a bit. Obviously, this big boy was headed for water. I sat watching, and a couple of times he pulled up short and actually looked over in our direction. I don't think he was necessarily looking at us, but I was hopeful that there was something over here he was interested in. And then he started angling a little bit more in our direction. Enough that I thought he might just pass by close enough. And then again, maybe not. Not long after that buck passed, I spotted a couple of more standing out in an alfalfa field. But it wasn't long before something got their attention and sent them running off the field. I started looking around. I couldn't believe it was us, and then I spotted a couple of does and a spike buck actually running in our direction. Something had these deer all stirred up. We'd watch, and they'd run in one direction and then stand there and sniff and look around and then run in the other direction. Some of them even ran right up to us. Unfortunately, not the right ones. Still, there were deer running all over the place. The fields would empty out, and then 20 minutes later, there'd be deer out again. Just before sunset, I sat watching a couple of bucks, including one that I was pretty sure would be a shooter, slowly working their way in across the alfalfa. I was pretty sure if they kept coming, they'd actually get to us before dark. That is, up until the moment that a doe and a fawn came running in from our right. I don't know what spooked them, but they picked up those two bucks and sent the whole group running out across the alfalfa field, out in front of an old gleaner and right on up the hill. I had no idea what was keeping these deer so stirred up, at least not until I talked to Brad that night when he told me he actually saw a mountain lion working down along the river, and I figured, yeah, I'd be a little skittish if there was a mountain lion following me too. The move out to the river bottom lease was obviously a good decision. We were seeing a lot more deer, and we were seeing them earlier, and some of them were obviously mature. As long as the wind held out of the south and we couldn't get back in on that big boy we'd seen the first night, I was pretty comfortable sitting down there on that irrigated alfalfa. That's one of the things, friends, when the hunting is really tough, you have to be flexible. especially if you want to be successful. A rooster pheasant was the first thing that came past our stand the next afternoon. We were watching him slowly picking his way down through the wheat stubble. He'd come to within 25 or so yards when he abruptly turned around and started heading the other way, and I started looking around and realized, we weren't the only ones watching that pheasant. A little spike buck followed by a doe and fawn were working their way up out of the river bottom, cutting across the field in front of us. And then 20 minutes or so after they passed, I heard a noise just to my right. I looked down. There was a buck right there just beneath us, going literally right underneath our feet. I reached over and grabbed my bow. He stopped at like 8 yards and stood there for a second, and then I passed. He'd be a shooter someday, just not today. Passing on that buck might have been a mistake, but we were seeing some that were much better. All we really needed to do was close the distance a little on one. And speaking of closing the distance, on the way back out that afternoon, Brad Morgan spotted a big old muley buck laying right out in the middle of the open out in some sagebrush, and his son Justin, after taking a look at him, wanted to close the distance on that muley real bad. We were headed back for the evening's hunt when Brad spotted a nice muley laying out in the sage.
But that one right there has got my attention.
Yeah, one of the right's a lot smaller.
Yeah, it is.
You think that one left is a small mule deer?
I wouldn't shoot it.
You put me on something bigger than that, buddy. We'll become best friends.
Unfortunately, there really was no way for Justin to get anywhere near that big old muley. Bedded right out there in the open like that, he was as safe as if he was on top of a mountain. So we did what we could. We headed for the trees. And within the hour, we already had some deer moving. It looked like this night might be a good one. Just before sunset, just like the day before, we were watching deer working their way out into the alfalfa. And there was at least one buck, an 8-point, that looked pretty promising. And even more promising than his looks was the fact that he was working his way pretty much in our direction. I figured if he kept coming all the way across the field down to the water hole in the river behind us for a drink in this hot weather, well, then we'd probably be close enough for a shot. And I remember figuring that right up until dark. But unfortunately, as the light faded, the only deer that passed in front of my arrow was this old doe. There were definitely some good deer moving around down there on the river, and even though I hadn't had my own close encounter with a big old good one yet, about 2 hours after daylight the following morning, we got word that Justin Morgan had. What'd you do?
I think I shot a decent 8.
Wait a minute, you think you shot a decent 8?
I'll tell you in a second.
You'll tell me in a second. You've been up and down that tree 9 times wanting to go follow this deer already.
So it's 6 o'clock this morning.
Uh-huh.
It's time.
No, I haven't come out here too far.
After hearing the details, we took up the trail. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before we started having trouble. By the time we reached the water, it was obvious. We had a decision to make. The sign was pretty thin and a little hard to track, so after following it about 100 yards, we kind of talked it over and came to the decision we should pull back and wait. And I know that's a tough choice, especially in the heat, but I firmly believe it's the right thing to do every single time. And as it turned out, about 3 hours later, T and I got a call. The guys had waited a couple hours and then gone back for another look. And
Yeah, he come in and I gave him a couple grunts to slow him down because he was cooking.
well, I think he smelled Mike, don't you? No?
No, I doubt it.
Tell the truth. Yes, you do. I really would have appreciated it if you'd have let me go along and recover him. But if you got to do it the hard way, I understand. Where was your dad?
Well, I don't know. I'd probably sleeping in the stand.
Oh, again? At least, you know what? At least they've got nice ladder stands so you didn't fall out.
That's right.
Well, are you happy?
I'm very happy. I couldn't ask for more.
What do you think of your trip to Wyoming now?
This is something special.
I know it started out tough. I mean, 100-degree heat is a little tough to bow hunt in.
That's true.
And there was some doubt. I mean, it was hot. We weren't seeing much. But true to Morgan form, the last day, the last minute, less than 8 hours before you got to be on a plane.
That's true.
Would you do it again?
In a heartbeat.
Yeah, I love this place. I do. I just love the deer here, and this is as hard as it's ever been. You got to come back and see what it's like when it's really good.
Dad and I were planning on coming back next year on the way over here.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear it. I know you guys got to go catch a plane. It's starting to get hot. We got to get that deer taken care of. But on behalf of myself and Miss T, congratulations. This is your first TV deer, right?
That's the first one.
And if I have my way, it'll be your last. Congratulations, really. You did a great job and a wonderful shot and a really, really nice Wyoming whitetail, bud.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Kyle, and thank you, Mike, for helping.
All righty. Oh, and while we're handing out thanks, we should too thank Eric and his whole family for the food and everything. It just turned out really good on a really, really tough week.
It was a great time.
So I got to know, is that an 8 or a 9? What do you call that?
That's 8.5 point.
It's 8.5. So that's a new subcategory. Is it like Safari Club, Boone and Crockett, Pope and Young / Wyoming, or is it / Morgan?
Right, both.
Yeah. The proper answer, I know you're young, the proper answer is yes.
Yeah, yes.
There you go. All right, let's go wake up your dad. Congratulations, Justin Morgan, on a great deer. And despite the fact that, as it turned out, the Morgans had to fly home that very day, we truly enjoyed our time with them, and we certainly look forward to the next time when hopefully there's a few less fires at home and a few more days to spend in the trees. We had a great time, guys. Thanks a bunch. And speaking of home, it was only a couple more days and T and I would have to head for home. So, seeing as how the wind had changed, we decided to get back at it. We were going to crawl up in another stand and hopefully see that big boy from the first night, or who knows, maybe even a better one. That afternoon, all we saw in the first hour was this porcupine and some turkeys. And then, just as the sun set, I heard a noise beneath us, looked down, and more turkeys. I suppose this would be a great place to go if you were looking for a Miriam's turkey, but right now I was kind of interested in something a bit bigger. Fortunately, about 10 minutes later, a doe and fawn worked their way out into the field in front of us and actually bedded down. It was so hot, the deer just weren't moving much. We did see one little buck start to work his way out, but if the bigger deer were going to get here, they'd have to do it pretty quick because it was getting pretty dark. And then, just as it was getting real dark, another doe and fawn came working up underneath the oaks, picking through the acorns. We only had about 15 minutes of daylight left, and this appeared to be all we were going to see. That is, right up until the time the doe threw her head up, I looked over, and there was a dandy buck. The one on the right was definitely a shooter. I sat there watching him, and holy smokes, a monster buck. Here was a huge 10 or 12 point, and he was headed my way. But when he passed behind some branches, I lost track of him for a while, and then he popped back out. Unfortunately, he was kind of angling away. Both of the bigger bucks were. I sat there thinking, should I grunt at him? Should I just wait? And in the end, all they did was just stand out there looking around. And then a noise right beneath us, and it was a quill pig. A porcupine was working right straight into us. I looked back out at the buck, and he was actually going the other way. And all I could do was watch him fade into the sunset. Man. That, friends, is a good old big one. Exactly the kind of monster buck I'd gone to Wyoming hoping to see. So despite the fact that tomorrow would be our last day in camp, I decided we were going to take another run at him. We certainly could have went back to the river where we were seeing a lot more deer, but when you get a chance to hunt a buck like that, well, if you're me, you just gotta try. And I should say that it was warmer, it was windier, but I went to the trees figuring, it really can't get any hotter. That's what I thought. And I was wrong.
Seriously?
Yeah, I know. It was 105 degrees at 3:45 in the afternoon. But you know us. Last night. It's only 105. It's the worst drought in years. Still. We'll see. It's like a sauna in here. Yeah, but it's a dry heat, right? Yeah, right. Believe me, I was shocked when I actually saw some deer movement while the sun was still up. A doe and fawn actually came in and started picking through the acorns and the oaks. I realize these animals are used to this kind of heat, but I gotta tell you, generally speaking, whitetails don't move around a lot when it's 100+ degrees. I don't care where you hunt them. And while it was encouraging to see any deer up on their feet, I didn't see them for long. In fact, within a half hour, the only thing moving was a red squirrel. Until just at dark, up on the hill behind us, there he was. He'd obviously rubbed off all his velvet overnight, but this was definitely him. And he was definitely going the other way. Despite not getting a shot at that big old buck, or any other buck for that matter, we still had a great time. When you consider how hot it was, how hard the conditions were to hunt in, we really did quite well. And when you throw on top of that, great friends sharing some great times, well, believe me, that is a memory worth making. That's the way it went on the hottest hunt I've done in a long, long time. And congratulations again, I should say, to Justin Morgan on cashing in during those tough conditions. And certainly thanks to Brad for sharing a great camp. And while I'm handing out thanks, I need to thank my lovely bride, Miss T, as well as Eric, Thomas, and certainly Mike Laraman, everybody out at Thomas Ranch Outfitters for all the hard work. Hopefully next time it'll be a little more normal. And speaking of normal, normally I'd hope to see some of you out there, and I do. I hope you're out there stalking a big old buck of your own, and if we do run into you, well, we're going to stop and share some deer stories, help you drag yours in, and then have that cup and a fire. And if we don't see you out there, friends, well, at the very least, I hope to see each and every one of you right back here when we'll share another adventure from my Wilderness Journal. Thanks again, Eric and Mike, everybody out at Thomas Ranch Outfitters.